Well, hello there. So, welcome to Critical Weight Theory, my podcast, and today we're exploring modernity through philosophy, science, time, and space, and also postmodernity. And we're looking at these fascinating concepts from philosophy, science, and modern culture. So today's episode explores the ideas of modernity and postmodernity with a special focus on how these eras shape our understanding of philosophy, ethics, and science. I am an armchair philosopher at best, a non scientist. I don't have a whole bunch of degrees hanging up on my wall or anything like that. In fact, I was a literature major when I was, earning my 4 year degree with a concentration in art. But, I'm not in a science lab full of beakers and I'm not, the next Einstein or anything like that. But I have gathered up some interesting talking points that may be interconnected in some ways, and they do have some things to do with science. And so I'm going to break these up into different segments. So today we're going to get two different segments, and then I'm going to have like a part two and a part three because I do have a lot of stuff going on here when we're trying to understand modernity. So I'm going to define modernity here. So it's an era characterized by a reliance on reason, scientific progress, the rejection of some so-called traditional values, and the pursuit of objective truth. So I'm also going to be talking about a philosopher, and I'm going to be looking at how modernity and postmodernity were, impacting him. So Immanuel Kant, I'm going to look at his influence a little bit. So in his critique of practical reason, Kant argues that morality rules and human actions are governed by what he called the categorical imperative, a principle demanding that actions be universally applicable. So Kant defines categorical imperatives as commands or moral laws all persons must follow, regardless of their desires or extenuating circumstances. So that is a summary from the Columbia University article on categorical imperatives and the case for deception, part one. That's where I got that from. And I'm sure there are many different takes on what Immanuel Kant believed, but it seems like that's pretty widely accepted as, what he meant by categorical imperatives. So that's already section one done and over with. I want to now talk about the shift to postmodernity and, how it ultimately impacted his philosophy or our understanding of it. The way that postmodernity has clashed with Immanuel Kant. So I'm going to define postmodernity just so you might better understand it, and so I'll understand what I'm talking about here. So postmodernity is a reaction to modernity, emphasizing freedom of choice, self-determination, responsibility, equanimity, and flexibility. So it's not necessarily like anti-modernity, but I can't talk today. But it's like an augmentation of the modern world. It's a sort of reaction to it. So postmodernism questions the narratives of objective truth and embraces pluralism. So that's one of the key ways that I guess you could say postmodernity would clash with Immanuel Kant's philosophy. There's a clash with postmodernism that is pretty significant. So for starters, Kant's critical philosophy is rooted in the belief that there are objective structures of knowledge that are universally applicable. He posits that the human mind has inherent categories and forms of intuition, such as space and time, that shape our experiences and knowledge. Well, that's at least what I understand based on what I've looked at. In contrast, postmodernism often questions the existence of any universal truths or structures, emphasizing the relativity and the context dependence of knowledge. Postmodern thinkers like Foucault and Derrida argue that knowledge is constructed through power dynamics and language, and there are no fixed truths. So, I do believe that I pronounced Derrida correctly. I'm not entirely sure, but so a lot of people have a problem with those two philosophers, and with postmodernism in general, because it's definitely convenient to think, well, some things are true, or however you want to look at it. Not everything is as context dependent as they might have us believe, or so that's what I believe as well. But that clashes with Immanuel Kant's philosophy. So, as far as metaphysics go, Kant introduces the idea of the noumenon, the thing in itself, which exists beyond human perception and understanding. He claims that we can never know the noumenon directly, but only the phenomena, the world as we experience it. So that's really vague, and to me it sounds like it's postmodern in itself. But postmodernism, on the other hand, in contrast to that, is often skeptical of such metaphysical distinctions, focusing instead on the ways in which reality is constructed through language, discourse, and social practices. So oddly enough, these two ideas, like that complicated idea, which almost sounds postmodern, can actually be challenged by postmodernism, which is interesting. And really, you might argue that's how postmodernism could actually be deconstructed itself, because as it seeks to seemingly depict everything as relative, well, then what do you even have left? If everything is just depending on our own subjectivity, then at the end of the day, what is there? It's like the plot of the Matrix or something. It's fun to imagine maybe we could be in the Matrix, but at the end of the day, then what would we even be talking about? How do you even prove anything if that's the case? I guess you could break free of it like Neo and the rest of them, but how would you do that in real life? That's just a movie and all that kind of fun stuff. So, well, I'm getting a little bit distracted thinking about that, but anyway, I think my point is pretty clear on that. You do learn that some notions are quaint, like the notion of an inaccessible thing in itself is often viewed as another grand narrative to be deconstructed, just as a postmodernist would do it. Although to me, when I just sort of deconstructed it there, it wasn't to earn some sort of, postmodernist cred. It was just because it's something that sounds, I don't know, really iffy. It sounds like you're almost not even talking about anything that's clear. Like there's nothing really there to even debunk. It's, something that I fully don't understand, and it seems like it's intentionally vague, so I wouldn't be able to understand it. But anyway, we're going to move on to the ethics component here. So Kant's moral philosophy is grounded in the concept of the categorical imperative, as I mentioned, which asserts that there are absolute universal moral laws derived from reason. Postmodernism typically rejects the idea of universal moral principles, favoring instead a more relativistic or context-specific approach to ethics. Postmodern ethics often emphasize the fluidity and contingency of moral values, arguing that they are shaped by cultural, historical, and social contexts. So that's something I'm a little bit more likely to agree on as far as the postmodernist movement is concerned, because to me it just seems like it's objectively true that moral values are contingent and fluid. Because if they weren't, then wouldn't it be the case that no one would be a hypocrite? No one would ever put their morals aside, or let life chip away at their morals and stuff like that, And I think that in history and, well, right now as I'm sitting here, people's morals are constantly being put to the test, and people do not always have an iron resolve. They're not all sticking to their principles and all that kind of stuff. And I can even say that in my personal life, to the point where I no longer feel like I'm that principled of a person, And I don't even mean that entirely in a negative sense. It's just more of a truth or a fact, I mean, look at this election, for example. I mean, we're left with no real good choices. I mean, you could vote. The options are pretty rotten, or you could not vote, which is also a rotten option. So I'm not going to get too much into the specifics of that, because I think politics would distract from this greater conversation. But at the same time, that to me seems like a pretty solid example of the flexible morality or ethics, whatever you want to call them. And there's also an aesthetics component. So Kant's aesthetics are based on the idea of universal judgments of beauty and the disinterested pleasure derived from contemplating art. Now, I don't know exactly what that means, right? I don't know if there is a better way to phrase that, but that's what I've been led to believe was his aesthetic argument. So postmodern aesthetics, however, challenge the notion of universal beauty and the disinterested viewer, highlighting the role of cultural and ideological influence in shaping our perceptions of art. So this is yet again a point where I would actually, I think, largely agree with postmodernism. In fact, there are certain contexts where a given work of art or a song or anything like that might actually take on additional meaning that it did not originally have. Like nostalgia, for example. There are songs that I basically love now that I might have hated when I was younger, or did hate. It's a big thing to have a nostalgia factor when you're analyzing art and music, or I suppose for people who are avid readers for literature too. But like old pop songs that I used to hear way back when I was younger, they're often improved just by the fact that I heard them when I was younger. And I'm not the only one who says that either. I've heard other people say things like that. So postmodern art often blurs the boundaries between high and low culture, embracing pluralism and challenging traditional notions of aesthetic value. So, like, when I was doing physical art more often, like painting and sometimes drawing, one of the things that artists around me might say is that, if you have art that's representational, it's almost like a form of cowardice. Now, I don't really agree with that, but that was like sort of the stereotypical modern art argument. If you're seeking to do like hyper realistic art, you're basically just a chicken who's afraid to pick up a paintbrush and explore what's really going on in their mind, or something like that. But for me, it's more simply about just abiding by what my own personal taste is. So in that sense, I guess you could say I am still postmodern or something like that. Whatever the term would be that a person would apply to just liking what you like, you know? And that's increasingly my attitude towards different musical genres too. Like, I'm less likely to be afraid of liking something outside of genres, that I've traditionally listened to. So if there's like, well, in a past episode, I said that I hated Ed Sheeran's The Shape of You. In fact, I called it the worst song that I've ever heard, maybe the worst song in history, something along those lines. But I will say that if Ed Sheeran came up with something that I thought was like a total masterpiece, well, I would give him credit for that. It would change my understanding of Ed Sheeran. Ed Sheeran would go up maybe at least a notch, I guess, depending on how amazing the hypothetical track would be. Like if it was just total dog shit or something, that'd be like, no, this is slightly better than Shape of You, but it's still not good. But if it was an absolute stunning masterpiece that's paralleled by anything I ever heard before, well, what can I say? I'd become an Ed Sheeran superfan. So in that sense, the labels of modernism or postmodernism or anything like that sort of go out the window, and I'm not overly concerned about, what I would call myself. It's just a matter of liking what I like. And, that's sort of how my philosophy kind of goes when it comes to politics too. Like I don't bother being bogged down that much by labels. So for example, I say I'm not really an anarchist per se, but I still like to view some issues through an anarchic lens. Technically, some major distinctions can be made there. Yet at the same time, I would still be open to applying certain, what could be called radical principles to a given situation. And it's similar to, just the basic concept of democracy. For me, democracy does not just equal voting every 2 or 4 years. It's also based on the condition that what you're voting for is actually liberating you and letting you maintain your ability to have a choice. Because if you're able to vote your rights away or the rights of other people away, well then you're not really participating in a democratic system. You're participating in a system that is gradually whittling away your rights, or at least the rights of other people. So it just becomes a meaningless label if your rights are on the chopping block, yet you still vote for it. It becomes absurd. If you're basically voting to lop off your own head, it doesn't really matter if it's a king doing that or something, or a president. It doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter that you are making the choice either. You're still lopping off your own head. So, democracy in that case is, well, it's killing you. It would literally be killing you. Well, that's sort of an extreme example, but I think it really drives the point home here. So when it comes to democracy, it's not as simple as saying that I'm 100% pro-democracy or, saying that I'm 100% against it, because why would I say that either? If the end result is a lot of harm throughout society as well as self-harm, then there's reason to oppose it no matter what we call it or however the process is done. So I don't view legitimacy as strictly something that is dependent on the process itself, but it has to at least partly involve the result as well as the intended consequence. So you can have the unintended consequence, which would be obviously very hard to know that you're voting for it, but you can also have what might be totally unpredictable consequences further down the road that I would not actually defend, but how are you supposed to know that those things are going to happen? So that complicates things as well. So what I'm saying, I guess, is that it really doesn't matter what you label everything at the end of the day, because labels could be meaningless. And if you're acting as your own executioner, then you're really not representing democracy, but instead human folly, or a variety of human folly. So, wow, yeah, I went off on a tangent there. But anyway, getting back to Kant's philosophy, so he emphasized universal structure or universal structures of knowledge, absolute moral principles, and metaphysical distinctions, which stands in stark contrast to the relativism, skepticism, and deconstruction characteristic of postmodern thought. So I don't know what you would call my thinking that I just expressed. It might be postmodern to some degree, and maybe I'm just going off on some wild tangents, but I don't know. It depends on how you want to view things partly. So I guess in that sense, maybe I am postmodern. I'm noting that your truth about what I'm saying here is relative. So how about that? Well, anyway, that just about does it for this little episode. I've been talking pretty thoroughly here, so I'm going to give it a rest, and I will eventually have a part 2 and a part 3 of this little series. Well, presumably, unless I get hit by a bus or something. So hopefully that prediction doesn't become true, and hopefully it's just a cute little comment that I made toward the end of this episode, but I guess we'll see.